Hi, everybody. Welcome to Philosopher Meets Critics. This event is hosted by the University of Cologne and the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. My name is Paul Silva. I'm a junior professor here at the University of Cologne, and I'm hosting today's event. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to introduce you all to today's author, his book, and his critics. Daniel Singer is our author. His book is titled Right Belief and True Belief, published with Oxford University Press in 2023. Dan is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania with a secondary appointment in the Wharton School of Business. Took his PhD from the University of Michigan. He's the author of a number of articles standing at the intersection of epistemology and social philosophy. Dan's first critic will be Amy Floweree. She's an associate professor of philosophy at Texas Tech University. Before that, she was a postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Cologne. She took her PhD in philosophy from Northwestern. She's published work on a wide range of topics in epistemology with papers on epistemic agency, evidentialism, doubt, and suspension. Her recent publications include a work called When to Psychologize, recently published with the Australasian Journal of Philosophy. Kate Nolfi is our second critic. Kate is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Vermont. Kate received a PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. Kate's primary research interests lie at the intersection of epistemology, metaethics, and the philosophy of mind. Topics that she's published on include the nature of belief, the nature of knowledge, pragmatic encroachment, and epistemic constitutivism. Her recent publications include a work called Epistemically Flawless False Beliefs, published with Synthèse. Ram Neta is our final critic. Ram is a professor of philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill, took his PhD from Pittsburgh. His primary area of research is in epistemology. Ram works on almost all areas within epistemology already mentioned and many others besides. Publications include The Basing Relation, published with the Philosophical Review not long ago. So these are our critics. Dan is again our author. And with that, Dan will kick us off with a summary of his book. Dan, please take it away.
Great. So thanks so much, Paul, for the warm introduction. Really appreciate being here, and thanks to the two universities for hosting this. I'm super appreciative to you, Paul, and also especially to the commenters, Ram, Amy, and Kate. So this is the second time we've the four of us have discussed this book, and I'm super appreciative of all the time that you guys have put into thinking about this. So for the viewing audience, I'm going to give a 15-20 minute-ish overview of the book. And then the commentators have some thoughts, and hopefully we can have some discussion. So the book is called Right Belief and True Belief. It's published by Oxford University Press at the end of last year, 2023. The central idea of the book is to try to understand what we ought to believe, which is what I call right belief. The central idea of the book is to try to understand right belief, what we ought to believe, in terms of the value of true belief. So let's get started by thinking about the value of true belief. So a lot of philosophers have liked the idea that true belief is epistemically good. So I'll give you a long list just to motivate it. So James tells us to believe truth, shun error. Descartes takes his goal in the Meditations to arrive at truth without ever going wrong. Alston says that the epistemic point of view is defined by the aim of maximizing truth and minimizing falsity in a large body of beliefs. We all know that Goodman loves true belief. He says that true belief is the ultimate value in the epistemic sphere. Lots of folks like to talk about how belief aims at the truth. So then the main idea of the book is to try to explain right belief, what we ought to believe, in terms of that thing that we all seem to agree is epistemically valuable. And then here's how the book fleshes that out. The main view of the book is called Truth-Loving Epistemic Consequentialism, or TLEC, if you want to say it like that. And that view says, a belief that P is right for an agent to have, if and only if, among the available options for belief, believing P promotes the greatest overall balance of having true beliefs and not having false beliefs. And so that's what the view says. It's not meant to be taken super literally. The view is also meant to apply to credences. And really, it's not meant to be about belief. I'm not trying to take a stand about beliefs or credences. It's really meant to be about how we represent the world. And the idea is, of the ways we have to represent the world, the one that we should have is the most accurate one. Okay, so in the first chapter of the book, which I'm not going to talk that much about, I lay out a methodology of what I call normative epistemology. Normative epistemology is meant to be an analog of normative ethics, where the goal of a normative epistemology, analogous to normative ethics, is to develop a complete and correct theory of right belief in every situation, like the goal of normative ethics is to develop a goal of right action in every situation. So in the first chapter, I say that we should think about the methodology of normative epistemology as analogous to the methodology of normative ethics. So we can think about cases and principles and things like that. But then what I claim in the book after chapter 1 is that if we do normative epistemology, what we'll land on is truth-loving epistemic consequentialism as the best theory of what we should believe. Okay, so as the list of thinkers I just gave you a second ago highlights, I'm obviously not the first person to think that true belief is valuable, and I'm not the first person to experiment with the idea that maybe we can understand what we ought to believe in terms of that. But this view has gotten very little uptake, mostly because people think it's kind of obviously false. So there are just a ton of objections to this view in the literature. So really prominently, people have rejected this view because of trade-off objections. And then if you don't buy the trade-off objections, there's other trade-off objections. And then if you don't buy those objections, there's a bunch of other objections to the view. So some people are worried about how the view says, or potentially says things like you should go around memorizing the phone book or counting blades of grass. Some people think that there's no concept of good such that we should promote good things. The next two objections on the list there about rationality aiming at the truth and truth-loving decision theory clashing. Those are objections in the formal epistemology literature against the formal analog of this kind of view. And then there's an objection about kind of pure norms like these truth-based norms predicting that we should do immoral things. So even though people have been attracted to this idea that true belief is valuable, the idea that we can explain what we ought to do in terms of that is highly objectionable, according to other people. So the bulk of the book, most of the chapters are dedicated to responding to these objections. I'm not going to go through all of that here. I'm going to focus on a couple of them. Those are the ones that I think the commenters are going to be most interested in, and kind of the ones that are most interesting. The whole book is interesting, but these are the most interesting. So let's start there. So let's start by thinking about trade-off objections. So here's a trade-off objection to get you the flavor to get to start thinking about this if you're seeing this for the first time. So this one's called Truth Fairy. It's a modified example from one from Carrie Jenkins. And it says, suppose you start with no reason to believe that P is true and no reason to believe that P is false. The Truth Fairy is a very powerful being, and she makes you the following credible offer. You accept P is true, and she'll arrange for you to have many, many justified or knowledgeable beliefs, and very, very few unjustified or unknowledgeable beliefs. However, she'll not ensure you that your belief in P itself will be justified or knowledgeable. So the worry here is that consequentialist views that say that you should try to get more stuff that's epistemically valuable, seem to say that you should believe P in this case, whereas most folks have the intuition that this is not the right kind of reason to believe P, that you shouldn't believe P in this case, epistemically anyways. So there's a few moves that I give to kind of respond to these trade-off objections. Here's one of the moves. So the first move is to point out that in ethics, among consequentialists, it's standard to distinguish between two kinds of ethical terms. So ethicists consequentialist ethicists typically distinguish between deontic terms. These are my terms for the terms, but let's call them deontic terms. So those are terms like what you ought to do, what you should do, what you must do, what's the right thing to do, and responsibility terms. Those are terms like blameworthy, praiseworthy, responsible. And I claim that we should make the same distinction in thinking about epistemic normative terms. So I think we should think that there are epistemic deontic terms, and those are going to be terms like right belief, what you ought to believe. And then there's epistemic responsibility terms, and those are going to be terms like justified, warranted, rational, knowledge, etc. So what defines both of these classes, and why I think this is a good distinction to make, is that deontic terms in both subfields, what they do is they talk about the action or the belief. And they talk about the action or belief with respect to the agent. So they say of the action or belief, that was the right action, or that was the right belief, or that was the wrong one. And they say that with respect to the agent. So that was the right action for that agent, but they're primarily about the action. Whereas responsibility terms primarily evaluate the agent. They say the agent was blameworthy for that action. So they evaluate the agent with respect to a belief. So deontic terms seem to be primarily about the individual thing that we're evaluating, whereas responsibility terms seem to be primarily about the agents who execute the thing that's evaluated by the deontic terms. And so then the move here to respond to trade-off objections like the one we just saw from Truth Fairy is to say that consequentialism in epistemology, like it's standardly construed in ethics, is only a theory of deontic terms rather than a theory of responsibility terms. So the truth fairy example was formulated as about responsibility terms. And so that would get rid of the truth fairy example, as well as a lot of other extant trade-off examples in the literature. That said, this is not going to solve all trade-off objections, and that's pretty easy to see. So here's a deontic trade-off objection. This is just another trade-off objection that this time is formulated in deontic terms. So this one's called God Grant, and it's from Fumerton. The example goes like this. I'm a scientist interested in getting a grant from a religious organization. I don't have sufficient evidence to believe in God. I think that belief in God is manifestly irrational, and let's assume that it's in fact true that there is no God. Despite that, I discovered that this organization will give me the grant only if it concludes that I'm religious. Further, I'm such a terrible liar that unless I get myself to believe in God, they'll discover that I'm an atheist. Having the grant will enable me to come to have many, many important and true beliefs that I wouldn't otherwise be able to have. And so here, like the other case, it seems like consequentialist views of deontic terms in this case, but consequentialist views are going to say that you should have the belief, you should believe in God. It's right for you to believe in God. Why is it right for you to believe in God? It's, oh, because you'll get all these other epistemic benefits. Whereas I think most folks think that that's not the right result. All right, so then here's two more moves that I think the consequentialist should employ to respond to deontic trade-off cases. One is that they should make the view sophisticated in the same sense that ethical consequentialist views are often thought, it's often thought that those should be sophisticated, following Railton. So what it would mean for an epistemic consequentialist view to be sophisticated is that it would say that a belief or credence is right if and only if it in fact conduces to epistemic goodness, and it denies the claim that agents ought to always think in those terms. So this kind of consequentialist view will say, it's just about evaluating the belief. It's not about saying how agents should think about things. So why does this help in response to trade-off? Well, this allows us to say that the belief can be right, even if the methods that are being used to produce those beliefs, like by someone who thinks, oh, I should do this because I'm getting, all these sophisticated things. The consequentialists can say you shouldn't think like that, even if it gets you to the right belief. Second move here, and again here we're following mirroring moves made by consequentialist ethicists, is that I think we should make the view global, and it'll be global in the sense that it applies the consequentialist criterion of evaluation not just to beliefs, but also to all other kinds of things like belief-forming dispositions, decision-making procedures, motivational schema, etc. And the reason we want to do this in order to reply to the trade-off objections is that it allows us to epistemically evaluate the belief-forming processes, so like believing because it's going to get you some later stuff, as opposed to believing because that's what your evidence says. We can evaluate those independently of whether or not we think the belief is right. All right, so then I claim that if we do both of those moves, we can make sense of a lot of the intuitions in the trade-off cases, and those reasons are why we can sort of put aside the trade-off cases. So the book discusses trade-off cases quite extensively. This is just a kind of quick summary. There's 2 chapters of the 7 chapters in the book are about trade-offs. So in the book, I also argue that there are some intuitively acceptable trade-offs. So it's not true in general in epistemology that we just hate trade-offs. I also argued that there's some theoretical benefits to accepting trade-offs. So even if you're like unpersuaded by all these examples, you should still think there's some theoretical reasons to do it. All right, but let's move off the trade-off thing. So a major theme of the book that I'm hoping you're starting to see by now is that the idea is that the way we should think of the best consequentialist view in epistemology is that view is likely going to mirror the best ethical view, best consequentialist view in ethics. So as you saw, a lot of the responses to trade-offs that I give are just mirroring responses to similar objections in ethics. All right. So in chapters 4 and 5, I do a similar kind of thing. A lot of the moves I do in chapters 4 and 5 are replying to objections, and a lot of those moves are inspired by views in ethics. So chapter 4 deals with 2 objections. I'll just talk about them really briefly. One is about trivial true beliefs. So I mentioned that earlier. That's about like memorizing the phone book or going around counting blades of grass. There's kind of 2 really high level moves I give there. One thing I say is that counting blades of grass or memorizing the phone book is a very not efficient way to get true beliefs. So that's one reason to think that consequentialist views are not going to predict that we should do that, is that you could probably get way more true beliefs by just going for a walk or watching a movie or talking to a friend or something like that. So that's one reason to think that consequentialist views are not going to predict that we should do these sorts of things. Another move is to say that in cases like, reading the phone book, given that agents like us are limited in our lifetime and the resources we have, there's better things that we could be doing with our life, all things considered. So the idea here is that ethical norms and maybe other kinds of norms are going to overrule epistemic norms in cases where the epistemic norms say the best thing you could be doing right now is memorizing that phone book right next to you. In almost all cases, there's better things we could be doing with our time that are not pursuing some epistemic goal. All right, so there's another objection in chapter 4 about whether or not there's a conceptually coherent way of thinking about consequentialism. Chapter 5 discusses a couple relatively technical objections to the view, construed as a view about credences rather than full beliefs. I'm going to skip those for now, but I encourage you to check those out in the book if you're interested. So I'm going to skip to chapter 6, where I talk about the question about whether or not epistemic norms and moral norms conflict. So here's a case to get you thinking about that. This case I call supposedly rational racist, and it's inspired by a case. It's basically copied from a case from Rima Basu, but simplified a little bit. Okay, so the case goes like this. Spencer is a waiter at a restaurant, and he has served thousands of black and white customers. Through his experience and research on the issues, Spencer's concluded that black customers tip less than white customers. While acknowledging the systematic factors contributing to this disparity, such as our racist social structure, Spencer still thinks that the black couple that just walked in will tip him worse than the white couple. Motivated by his need for rent money, Spencer thereby prioritizes serving the white couple over the black couple. So using cases like this and another well-known case called Cosmos Club, Tamar Gendler has a very well-known paper where she lays out a kind of puzzle. So here's my reformulation of the puzzle. It involves 4 steps. So the first step is that epistemic norms, like those predicted by truth-loving epistemic consequentialism, but also other kinds of epistemic norms. So epistemic norms will require taking into account information about racial disparities. Premise 2 is that if we take into account that information about racial disparities, we'll believe things about people on the basis of their race. The third step is that in many cases where we believe things about people on the basis of their race, norms of anti-racism require that we not believe those things on the basis of race. So then the conclusion there is that epistemic norms and norms of anti-racism, which I think of as kinds of ethical norms, so the conclusion is that epistemic norms and ethical norms of anti-racism conflict. So in the book, I try to argue that there's 3 things we should want from a response to a puzzle like this. And so here are the 3 things we should want. Ideally, we should want that we can say that there is no conflict between epistemic norms. We also want to hopefully maintain the idea that racist beliefs are wrong. And what that means is that agents in cases like Spencer's or in Cosmos Club are wrong to hold the purportedly racist beliefs. And then the last constraint is that we want the agents to take their information into account. So we want to say things like agents in the cases like Spencer's or in Cosmos Club ought to take into account the information about racial disparities and the races of those they're interacting with, not just ignore that information. So moral encroachers claim that they can accept all 3 desiderata, that they've got a solution for thinking that we can get all 3 of those goals in response to Gendler's puzzle. I don't think the moral encroachment solution works. I suspect that Kate does think it works, and I suspect we'll get into this a little bit. But I don't think it works. At a really high level, here's why I don't think it works. So compare a case like Spencer's, where Spencer's got the information about the 2 couples that just walked in. It's a black couple and a white couple, to a different case where Spencer just totally lacks the racial information about the couples that walks in. So I claim that if moral encroacher is going to say that there's a difference in how agents should act in those 2 cases, then they're going to run afoul of either saying that racist beliefs are wrong, or they're going to run afoul of no conflict. And the idea is, well, if agents have that information about the racial facts about the couples that just walked in, they're going to factor that into their thinking, either in a way that's going to get them to think in a racist way, or in a way that's going to make it such that epistemic and moral norms conflict. If, on the other hand, moral encroachers don't say that there's a difference between those two cases, that agents should act exactly the same in the case where they know the racial information and they don't know the racial information, then I claim that moral encroachers are going to not be satisfying the desideratum that agents should take information into account. So they won't be fully explaining the epistemic norm in play. So then what I think we should think about the puzzles, I think we should just think that moral and epistemic norms do conflict. And I think we should think that that's true and just not really that big a deal. So for one reason to think it's not a big deal is that in many cases where epistemic norms and moral norms conflict, that the sense of epistemic rightness in play is not all that strong, all things considered. So it's epistemically right to do this, but like all things considered, it's not that important. And in many of those cases, moral norms are going to take precedence over the epistemic norms. So that's what I think is going on in a lot of these cases involving racism, is I think you should not be racist, but the reason why you should not be racist is because of the moral norms. And then I think there's a move here that's available to views like mine, which is to say that, okay, theorists don't like there being a conflict between moral and epistemic norms, but we can explain why there is a conflict between moral epistemic norms as a symptom of our deeply racist social systems. If we didn't have those racist social systems, then the kinds of conflicts that we see in puzzles like Endler's wouldn't arise. So obviously this is a very tiny symptom, bad symptom of these systems, but that's just one of the symptoms of those systems. All right, so starting to wrap up, at the end of the book, I say there's 5 defining features of what a good epistemic consequentialist view should look like. So first, it should be bipartite in the sense that it distinguishes between deontic notions and responsibility notions, like we talked about. It should also be sophisticated in that it should say a belief is right if it in fact conduces to epistemic goodness. It should not say the same thing about how we should think about beliefs. The view should also be global in that it applies this consequentialist way of evaluating things not just to beliefs, but also to belief-forming dispositions, decision-making procedures, motivational schema, etc. The view should be veritist in that it should say that epistemic value is essentially about true beliefs or accurate credences or accurate pictures of the world, however you want to construe that. And then finally, it should say that the kind of value in play is diachronic. That is, it should not say that when we're trying to think about the value in play, we should ask just about when you adopt the belief or credences or way of representing the world. We should think about those things through time. All right, so a couple more things before I wrap up. You might say, hey, wait, you just purported to give us an entire system of epistemology, and you didn't say shit about justification or evidence, which when you teach an introduction to epistemology class are like the main things that you usually tell people. Well, there's also knowledge, I guess. But justification and evidence are like supposed to be really big deals in epistemology. Okay, so quickly, what do I think is going on with that? So one thing I want to say about justification is that our use of justification talk is part of our broader social practices of holding others epistemically responsible. So I think when you look at what's going on in the normative stuff in epistemology, there's the deontic stuff, there's the stuff about what you should believe, and then there's the responsibility stuff. And I want to say that justification is part of the responsibility stuff, and it's part of a broader set of responsibility stuff that's instantiated by our social practices of holding each other epistemically responsible. And then in the book, I talk about how to think about that in terms of justifying the practices at a societal level. And I argue that this way of thinking about justification is actually compatible with and explains a lot of the intuitions behind a lot of the popular views of justification. What about evidence? Well, one thing I'm going to say is that evidentialism about right belief is wrong. So I don't think it's true that you should believe what your evidence supports. But that's compatible with thinking that evidentialism about justification is right. It could be true that you're justified, which again is a responsibility term, when you believe what your evidence supports. So what I think is going on with evidence, or a plausible, you don't have to think this to go in for this kind of consequentialism, but a plausible kind of thing to say that's going on here is that evidence is often our best guide to the truth. And so that's how evidence gets in. It's more on the how do we get to believing what we should believe rather than defining what we should believe. All right. So one last benefit I want to throw out there before wrapping up is that if you buy this consequentialist way of thinking, that says epistemic norms are all about getting at the truth, then this kind of naturally generates a broader approach to all the broadly epistemic stuff. So it's not just answering this kind of narrow question about norms. So if you take this to be a broader approach about epistemology, one thing that's really natural to say here is that epistemic norms aren't just about belief. We can explain the sense in which epistemic norms are also about what reasoning patterns we should use, what hypotheses we should consider, what statistical tests we should do, what thought experiments we can do. And I take those to be not so controversial so far, that people think, oh, there's epistemically right reasons to do the statistical test rather than the other one. But I think it can go even further. So we can explain the sense in which there's epistemic reasons to listen to the testimony of others. There's epistemic reasons to organize scientific lab groups in a certain way. There's epistemic reasons to hire certain postdocs rather than others. And even I think there's going to be epistemic reasons to eat sandwiches and drink energy drinks. So Sarah Aronowitz and I have a paper arguing for that explicitly. And then lastly, this kind of global and truth-centric perspective will give us insights into how to it'll give us insights, but also practical guidance about questions in a wide range of disciplines outside of philosophy, things in science, law, politics, etc. So some research that collaborators and I've done that I don't discuss at length in the book is applying this kind of framework to thinking about how different ways of managing memory in groups might impact the group's ability to get at accurate conclusions. We use this kind of approach for thinking about how diversities in juries might influence the accuracy of the verdicts in juries. We use this kind of approach for thinking about how practices that benefit individual scientists in getting true beliefs might clash with practices that promote getting at the truth in the broader scientific community. So I think if you adopt this kind of global truth-centric perspective on epistemology, it makes epistemology very fecund for answering, very well suited for answering questions outside of philosophy. All right, so that's the high-level summary. Thanks so much again to everyone. I really appreciate everyone watching this and the commenters and Paul and the two universities. Again, thanks a lot.
Oh, thanks so much, Dan. I realized that I didn't specify an order for commentators at the beginning. Amy, would you like to go first? And then maybe Kate and then Ram? This is the order you're appearing on my screen.
All right. I want to thank Daniel so much for writing this book. As somebody who got really caught up in this debate and lost a little, and not a consequentialist by any stretch, I really appreciate reading such a careful analysis. And it's really a groundbreaking kind of book that takes insights from ethics and applies them with painstaking care. To a project that many people, I guess myself included, though not entirely, really kind of thought was hopeless. And so it is, I want to say, a triumph to read this book and hear Daniel bringing such insight. So my comments are coming from a place of great admiration for your work and what you've managed to accomplish here. So I'm going to make 3 points. This PowerPoint is meant to be just so that, people who are watching this don't get so hopelessly bored or fixate on my glasses. So the 3 points that I want to make is I want to talk a little bit about the separateness of persons / propositions in the analog between epistemic consequentialism and ethical consequentialism. I want to raise the normative question, one that people in epistemology people in the reasons literature have thought is really important, and ask Daniel to say more about why believers should care about this view of belief. And then I have a final point. It's a kind of concern about what I'm calling shibboleth beliefs, ones that are in fact objectively terrible beliefs, but that we have to, in order to participate in unjust societies, adopt, and the ways in which this system seems to suggest that those are in fact justified, or sorry, not justified, wrong word. Those are in fact correct, good ones to have, and but they seem to promote a kind of conservatism towards overthrowing injustice. Okay, so those are my 3 points. To my mind, the thing that your book does, Daniel, that's really important is separating the notion of rightness from responsibility. On your view, I think I should say, I'll say on Daniel's view, since we're sitting right here, both. On your view, or on Daniel's view, the question of what is right is prior to the question of what the agent should do. And so what we should be thinking about when we're thinking about epistemic normativity first is not justification or the kinds of responsibility terms we have for others, but in fact, just what is the correct thing for them to do. And this gets around a lot of the problems that philosophers have raised. So one of the big challenges to epistemic consequentialism is raised in a series of papers by Salim Berker. And Berker is concerned that epistemic consequentialism faces a similar trade-off to ethical consequentialism, which is supposed to be devastating. I, in fact, find it devastating, but I did spend a fair bit of time at the Center for Epistemology in Kant, so I'm very sympathetic to the Kantian project here. So in the ethical case, we're faced with the option of cutting up one healthy person to save 5 ill people. On a consequentialist kind of model, it sounds like, well, that will maximize the positive outcomes. 5 people live, only 1 person will die, much better than 5 people dying. And this is rejected because, many think, it ignores the separateness of persons. It's impermissible to make these kinds of trade-offs across persons. Berker applies this objection to ethics and thinks it's impermissible to make these kinds of trade-offs across propositions. I will note that it seems like there's a really big difference between a proposition and a person, namely you can wrong a person. I don't think you can wrong a proposition, but I could be open to argument on that. And so we have a number of cases. And so here I'm going to come back to my PowerPoint. So here are 2 cases, stylized versions of the ones Berker gives. So Bob is a master of introspection. He can iteratively introspect his beliefs 7 times over. So if he believes P, he can infallibly believe that he believes P and believe that he believes P, so on. And so for each belief he has, he generates 7 infallible beliefs. And Berker says, the epistemic consequentialist must say that he's justified. Because here, each belief he has, no matter how wacky or unreasonable it is going to result in 7 infallibly justified beliefs. Like the inferential patterns are just great. And another one that Berker presents is the large prime numbers. So Maddie has a rule for any number over 100. He believes it isn't prime. So pitch any number at him, 773, 641. He's going to believe that's not prime because there aren't very many prime numbers over 100. They're not very densely populated. They're infinite number, but they're not densely populated. And so, it's probably not prime. This is going to give him a huge number of true beliefs since most numbers are not prime. And so the epistemic consequentialist must say that his belief is justified, even though he has no understanding about why or whether the thing is prime or not. So on Daniel's model, we're not talking about justification. So we don't get these weird consequences that the belief is justified, but we still may get the view that they are right, that they're the right ones to believe because these models do promote true beliefs. And so, well, I think it avoids Berker's concern. I'm not sure, because it's not about justification, I'm not sure that it actually satisfies the reader. And this is kind of like a foot stomper objection that Daniel takes up in the book. So I don't usually like to be a foot stomper, but I'm going to stomp a little bit. Just because Bob has all of these true beliefs that come out of this one false belief, they're not really valuable. I mean, I suppose introspection is valuable, but usually it's like the first order or at most the second order. And the underlying first belief that he might have could be completely ridiculous. It doesn't matter. And so we might think that there is a big criticism to be made of Bob. And in fact, there's not any value in what he's doing when he sort of sits in these introspective moments. And it's independent of whether he's justified in those beliefs. It's just that those aren't good paths to be traveling down. Same for, counting blades of grass and reading the phone book. Daniel's response to this is that it is not an efficient way to get true beliefs because you're going to get a lot more if you were doing other things than just introspecting. Okay, so now let's consider another, at least that's what I think he's going to say from past experience. So let's consider Jane. Jane has 2 options. She could study her organic chemistry textbook for the next 8 hours. It's tedious and hard, and she's going to remember like 5%. Or she could just scroll TikTok, and her algorithm right now is like really informative about, does your cat love you? 5 signs to know you're the alpha. Like a lot of things she's going to learn about her relationship with her cat from scrolling through here. And she's actually going to retain a fair bit, and it's going to be a lot of information. it seems like we want to be able to say that even if the TikTok route is the most efficient route, as an educator, I'm committed in saying she should still study for her organic chemistry book, her organic chemistry test. Even though it's going to be extremely difficult, it's going to have a low rate of return. Those beliefs are more valuable, more important, more weighty than the easily fed ones. And so my concern is that the efficiency route is maybe not exactly what we want, particularly if we have goals that require difficult achievements. All right. So I have one more point that kind of comes up. It comes up later in the book, but I'm sticking it here now. And this is the phenomenology of a trade-off. So Daniel describes these bottleneck beliefs, ones where you just can't kind of get past that one belief to get to a bunch of true ones. And if you could just sort of bypass it or just believe this one thing, you're going to end up with a lot of true beliefs in the end, and it would be right for you to go ahead and do that. And so there are a number of trade-offs that are going to meet this one, like the scientist who needs to believe the thing to get the grant, or the student who just can't get past their creationist beliefs to get all of these true scientific beliefs. It would be good for them to just sort of believe, regardless of their evidence, in order to get past the bottleneck. So the case that Daniel gives is Eli and the age of the earth. Eli has a lot of evidence from their upbringing about about the way the world is, but they have to set it aside. She has to set it aside, Daniel thinks, in order to come to get all of these true beliefs in her science class. And this is a good way of bypassing the bottleneck. And my thought here is that there's a certain kind of phenomenology that is weird about this idea of you could just believe the thing you think is false and get past it. And there's another thing that you could do that would be better, and also maybe more that would also be easier. And that is to adopt a kind of possible framework of thinking. This is a way of thinking about the world. This is a possible way to think about it. So, for example, I got flack for this at the APA, but when I was taught the Bohr model of the atom, I was told this is a model, it's false, but it's a good way to think about things. And that was a way to get past that to learn the next thing. When I got to college and took chemistry, I was like, wow, this is amazing. It's like I knew it was coming, but it was so much cooler than I thought it would be. And so there's a way of saying, like, even if this thing is false, I can still use it as a tool going forward. Now, in the case of Eli, I think actually something slightly different is going on, which is that Eli has stepped into a world where she's asked to adopt a different framework, a different set of assumptions. And there's a way of sitting with that and allowing it as a kind of pretense, as a kind of model of this is how other people see the world. And this is, in fact, something that I think as philosophers, we try to train our students to do, think about things from a different perspective. It's not to say that Eli couldn't perhaps do the thing that Daniel suggests here. But in fact, I think the better thing, and maybe the more cognitively available thing, is to entertain the possibility as a kind of pretense, as a kind of like, could this be the thing? Now, there were arguments that Daniel has against this, but I just think phenomenologically, this is a powerful way to approach things in the world, and it develops cognitive empathy, which is its own sort of value. All right. Nope, we're not there yet. Normative question. Here we go. So truth, this is a high-flying question that I just want to invite Daniel to say more about. The normative question often comes up as Korsgaard raised it, in ethics, but it also is for any kind of normative practice. Why is that this thing you just told me is the thing I should do? Why? How does it get its grip on me? Or different ways people have of talking about why should I view that as authoritative? So if you give somebody truth-loving consequentialism, what are they meant to do with this thing? One thought that I had as I was reading this book is that it's a lot about belief. It's a lot about why this belief would be good or this belief would be bad. And I just would invite Daniel to say more about the persons who house these beliefs, who are living in the collection of the system, representing the world this way, to think about why the consequentialist kind of model is a good one. And it occurs to me that maybe that's not a question you think this theory should answer. And if so, I'd like to know more. One of the concerns that I have is that as agents, we often seek out knowledge that's really, really hard to get and seems to not maximize anything. And in fact, either because of our curiosity or because we're just wired weird, we're like, no, I really just want to understand normativity. And like, maybe you never can. And it seems to me like agents, when they're asking about what kinds of questions to pursue, they're not thinking about maximization at all. And so I just invite you to say more about why this sort of view would be attractive from an agent who's trying to self-reflectively think about what they should believe. Okay, last point, shibboleth beliefs and truth begets truth. So shibboleth beliefs here, I am thinking of beliefs that you have to endorse in order to be a part of the tribe, or in order to, pass the test and be trusted, in order to be given status in the community. So I define these as their social gatekeeping beliefs. In order to be successful in some social structure, one must endorse a set of beliefs. And in unjust social structures, these will be ideological beliefs that reinforce that power structure. So the examples that Daniel gives in the book, believing in God to get a grant, but you could also imagine believing in Nazi propaganda to keep one's job as a researcher, believing that women are intellectually inferior in order to not be viewed as threatening, believing in the dominant religion, believing in some scientific framework, believing in a political movement, or believing that ethics and feminist philosophy are not really philosophy. I think this one is dying out, but it was definitely impressed upon me at one point in my career that if I wanted to be taken seriously, I had to reject those as real philosophy. So the structure of these are purely the same as the trade-offs for the scientist. I mean, one of them just is the scientist who gets himself to believe in God to get the money for the grant. But I think that the problem here is a little bit, it comes into conflict with this truth begets truth principle. So one of the reasons why we're not going to have to worry too much about trade-offs on Daniel's view is that truth begets truth. So as a general rule, having a true belief about a given proposition is the best way for us to promote the overall accuracy of our epistemic states. So like the trade-offs will happen, but there won't be very many of them. But my concern is in an unjust social structure, the trade-offs will be located in a very specific place, and they will be highly concentrated in ways that cause a great deal of harm. Like maybe we won't get a lot of feminist philosophy because we don't think it is philosophy. Or maybe we will, have a government that persecutes certain minorities because we all had to buy into the belief that that was okay to do. So in unjust social situations, it's not that truth begets truth is necessarily false, but it's not going to impact the thing that's maximizing knowledge. So if you're the Nazi scientist, you could go off and do, let's suppose you do botany, a lot of botany with these Nazi beliefs, but the error is not huge for you because you're not drawing off of those beliefs for inference. You just did them to get into the structure. But it's going to concentrate those errors in specific places that are going to cause a great deal of harm. And so my concern is that the truth-loving consequentialist is conservative in a way where it shouldn't be. All right. I think I had more things to say, but I'd just like to invite Daniel to say more about these things now. And if there's back and forth on the Q&A, that's fine.
Great. Daniel, please.
Great. Thanks so much, Amy. Your comments are super rich, and there's a lot of things to discuss in there. Okay, so there's so I certainly want to engage in at least two of the things that you brought up, although there's a lot of things that you brought up this time and in comments that you sent me, and so please, feel free to push back if you think I'm unfairly ignoring something. So one general theme of questions towards the beginning of the comments was about the weight of true beliefs. So you start out by talking about what I say about the trade-off objections, and then you want to think particularly about trade-off objections where the downstream beliefs are kind of like stupid tiny beliefs. So like in Bob's case, it's like, oh, if Bob just believes that there's a fish on the table, then I'll get these 7 introspective beliefs that are all true. And so, so then according to the consequentialists, he should believe that there's a fish on the table. All right, so a couple thoughts there. So one is that it's not obviously right to me that that in the introspective case, that the view has to predict that it's going to be right for Bob to believe that there's a fish on the table. And one reason is because with real humans, when we form beliefs, they often come along naturally with lots of other kinds of beliefs. So introspective beliefs, in the kinds of case, so I know that case is inspired by a similar case from Berker, but introspective beliefs are a little bit weird where on this way of thinking about introspective beliefs, when we get one, or when Bob gets one, he just gets another one that's a higher level one, and they don't really do much else in our cognitive architecture other than just sort of base out these higher level ones. But when we have a belief like there's a fish on the table, that's going to generate all kinds of other beliefs for us. So if there's a fish on the table, I might also believe that there's a real risk that I don't know why I choose this example, but there's a real risk that the table is going to be messy in a second, and I should be concerned about that. And so there's all these other beliefs that belief generates for me now and in the future, that if I have that original belief that I'm going to get all those too. So it's not obviously right to me that that this view should predict in cases like that that kind of any belief at the first level is right. All right, so that's one thing about the particular example, but your point generalizes away from that particular example, right? It's not really wedded to that. And the way it generalizes away is that it becomes more about the value of those kind of tiny, stupid beliefs and what those mean on my view. So it becomes more about the concern about the view predicting that we should memorize the phone book or count blades of grass. And you're right to point out that the one general move in response to those kinds of worries that I give in the book is that I say that's typically an inefficient way for us to collect beliefs. So I love your example about Jane, where she has 2 options. She can either study organic chemistry, which in the short run is not going to produce very many true beliefs for her because it's really hard, or she could watch TikTok. I should admit that I spend way more of my time than I'm happy to. Well, this is going on YouTube, right? Well, anyways, I'm not going to finish that sentence, but I do like TikTok. But okay, so I love that example, and I think you're right to suspect that there's a very reasonable intuition here that what Jane should do is study organic chemistry. And there's one move that you point out in the comments that I can give here, which is to say, oh, but if she does that in the long run, that'll get her lots of true beliefs, more so than the particular beliefs about the baby capybara or her hippopotamus or whatever on TikTok, despite how demure that might be. Okay, great. I've just figured out which one of you guys also are on TikTok. So I think you're right to point out that one move here is to say that if you study chemistry in the long run, you'll get more beliefs than if you just watch some baby hippopotamuses. I do think that move is right. Another kind of concern, though, I have about a case like this is that our intuitions about a case like this, I think, involve both epistemic and moral intuitions. And we think, when we're thinking about someone like Jane, assuming that she's in a position to study organic chemistry or watch TikTok, so we're probably imagining a relatively young person where chemistry is going to be somehow relevant to their lives, either via a grade or the career or something like that. And so I think I suspect in cases like that, we have moral intuitions that are also going into what we think is right. And I suspect that the moral intuitions heavily push in favor of of thinking that chemistry is the right thing to do rather than TikTok, which again is something I should, think about in my own life. But I'm inclined to think that that's a moral issue. So it's not obvious to me that our intuitions here are kind of clean, like we'd like a case to be here. So that's one kind of concern. Maybe I would love to hear what you think about that, Amy, but I want to also throw out, if it's okay, a reaction to the shibboleth beliefs that you discussed, because I think that's super interesting. So I think you're absolutely right to point out that in a lot of social systems, there are these shibboleth beliefs, as you call them, where you need to sort of believe these, or at least act as though you believe these, in order to successfully be part of that social structure. And so one example that I give is kind of God grant, and I'm not sure how much that resonates with folks now, but it's a lot of theorists recently, and certainly something that resonates with me, is something like maybe accepting certain racist or misogynist beliefs in order to be part of extant, like our current social systems. So I think this is both a really interesting point, and I think you're right to point out that our extant knowledge systems have that feature. And I do think you're right also to point out that that is plausibly one way in which misogynistic or racist systems perpetuate themselves, is by forcing folks to accept those kinds of beliefs in order to enter the system. And yeah, okay. I also think you're right to point out that these are cases where truth beget truth fails. And what I say in the book is that as a general rule for beliefs, having a true belief is how you get other true beliefs. So then cases like trade-off cases are going to be really weird ones, where having a false belief gets you true beliefs. And so I think you're right to point out that these shibboleth belief cases are cases where that fails. One thing that I think is particularly interesting about the cases with the shibboleth beliefs is that the cases I consider in the book of cases where truth begets truth fails, those are mostly kind of ephemeral cases, where it's like you have this false belief about this dumb thing that doesn't really matter, and then you get all these true beliefs. And I think you're right to point out that we can get the same thing, and plausibly do get the same thing, with beliefs that are kind of systemic, structural, and stick around. So they're kind of more central beliefs than the kind of ephemeral case that I talk about in the book. That all said, I still wonder how common these are. So I want to grant you that these are really important cases of failure of truth begets truth. But I suspect that truth begets truth, that claim, is still true, because the claim there is just that it's relatively uncommon, or actually quite uncommon, compared to the broader scheme of beliefs that we have. So I suspect that it's still true in like the broad scheme of beliefs that we have, that in most cases having a true belief is how we get other true beliefs, despite the fact that you pointed out that there are some really interesting cases where that fails. All right, so okay, so maybe I'll stop there to give Amy a second to reply, if you have a reaction.
Yeah, so this is where, as an objection, I'm just really glad to hear your thoughts, because I think you're probably right that the entirety of scientific knowledge is going to be not requiring certain kinds of beliefs, but I do think that the kinds of falsity that they're going to embody, or maybe this comes back to the weighting of the true beliefs, like they're very important that we get those things right. So one thing that I know, this is going on YouTube, but like academics who are maybe in a state like Texas at a public university should not comment on certain global affairs in the Middle East right now. And that creates a kind of pressure to conform to a certain belief pattern that is in fact dehumanizing. And so it's not even so much that they're common, but that they're really important not to get wrong. And so and I'm not even phrasing this as an objection so much, because I don't think it falsifies truth begets truth. It just builds on this idea that some truths are more important, and these are some more important ones. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, Amy. I think that Ram is also going to be pushing me later on how we measure how important different truths are. So maybe we can come back to that, or maybe a spoiler is that I'm not going to have very satisfying answers to that, but we'll see how that part of the discussion goes. Yeah. So thanks again, Amy. I really appreciate it. And there was lots of other things that I didn't get to address, but I really appreciate you giving me these comments and thinking so hard about it. So thanks a lot.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan and Amy. Kate, please share your comments.
I want to thank Paul for organizing this and for the invitation to speak. And Dan, it has been such a pleasure to engage with this book. As As you know, because we've talked about this before, I'm sympathetic to a lot of what you say here. And as I'll suggest later on, I'm at least in some moods, I'm tempted to think that a global, sophisticated, consequentialist story is the right kind of story to tell, at least about one important dimension of epistemic normativity. But you know, uh, for the sake of generating discussion, I'm going to talk about the part of the book that I am less sympathetic to. And so my comments are going to focus, at least initially, on material from chapter 6. So this is the chapter where the book is engaging with the literature on pragmatic encroachment um, and as I read it, the point of this chapter is basically to neutralize a particular sort of threat to your favored brand of truth-loving global sophisticated epistemic consequentialism. And the threat comes in the form of a challenge to account for our intuitions about certain sorts of cases, the kinds of cases that are typically used to motivate pragmatic encroachment, or sorry, moral encroachment. And the case that you used at the beginning of the session here was the case of Steve, the waiter who is faced with forming a belief about whether a particular set of Black patrons is likely to tip less than white counterparts or something like that. So if it turns out that embracing moral encroachment is the ticket to kind of accounting for our intuitions about these sort of cases, then it looks like truth-loving epistemic consequentialism is in trouble. And so in the book, you've got a kind of two-pronged attempt to sort of neutralize the threat here. The first prong is aimed at showing that the moral encroacher's attempt to account for our intuitions about these cases actually doesn't give us as much as we might have hoped. And then the second prong is aimed at showing that truth-loving epistemic consequentialism can actually give us sort of does an adequate job of accounting for our intuition in these cases. Predictably, I'm going to suggest that the work that this chapter doesn't quite neutralize the threat, and I have worries about the first sort of prong, the attempt to say that the moral encroacher doesn't give us an account of our intuitions in here that in these cases that is as satisfying as we might want. And then I'll have a little bit to say about the second prong as well. Okay, so this is kind of a review of the review, Daniel, that you gave us at the beginning of the session. But in this chapter, you identify 3 desiderata for a solution to what you call the puzzle here, Gendler's puzzle. I take it the puzzle is just kind of accounting for our intuitions in these sorts of cases. So the first desiderata is just that there be no conflict between epistemic norms and moral norms. So we'd like a story that accounts for our intuitions about these cases, according to which there's no conflict between epistemic norms, what we epistemically ought to believe and what we maybe morally ought to believe, or what it would be epistemically right to believe and what it would be morally right to believe. The second desiderata is that racist beliefs turn out to be morally wrong. Whatever story we tell about our intuitions here should vindicate that idea, that the racist belief, the belief that this particular Black patron is likely to tip less than the white patron sitting at the next table or something like that. We want that belief to come out as ethically problematic or morally problematic. And then the third desiderata is that we want to vindicate the idea that we ought, epistemically speaking, to take into account information about racial disparities and the races of those individuals with whom we interact. So we don't want to tell a story in accounting for our intuitions about these cases according to which it turns out to be just fine to ignore information about racial disparities or information about the race of a particular person about whom we're forming a belief. Okay, so the moral encroacher claims that they've got a story to tell about our intuitions in these cases that meets all three of these desiderata. But Dan, you think they're wrong about that. Either they can't meet the third desiderata or they can't meet the first desiderata. I take it the moral encroacher, I mean, kind of what gets moral encroachment off the ground in the first place is like a commitment to desiderata number 2. So I take it they're not going to want to give up, like that desiderata is not on the table for them. So the sort of thrust of your critique here is like they can't have 1 and 3 at the same time. So the argument for this comes in 2 steps. The first is, as I read it, the first is that meeting 1, that is the no conflict desideratum, requires that moral encroachment be a view about epistemically right or permissible belief and not merely a view about rationality or justification. So the moral encroacher, your moral encroachment has to yield the verdict that that belief in the racist proposition, so the proposition that this Black patron is going to tip less than, or is very likely to tip less than their counterpart who is white. The moral encroachment must yield the verdict that that belief is epistemically wrong or impermissible. So it's not the belief that one ought to have. Step 2 of the argument here, as I see it, demands that or sort of points out that to meet the taking information account of the desideratum, or the taking information into account desideratum, the moral encroacher would need to identify some difference between what a informed agent, so like Steve in the diner, the tipping case that you gave at the beginning, what it would be right or permissible, epistemically right or permissible for an informed agent to believe versus what it would be epistemically right or permissible for an ignorant agent to believe. So this, sorry, think of the ignorant agent as like a version of Steve. This is how you do it in the book, who gets an eyelash in his eye. And so just like can't visually discern the race of the particular patron in front of him. And so has no information about the race of this patron. And the thought, I think the idea here is something like, in order to meet the taking information into account desideratum, the moral encroacher is going to have to say what it's epistemically right or permissible for the informed agent, the informed Steve, to believe has to be somehow different from what it's epistemically right or permissible for ignorant Steve the guy who gets the eyelash in his eye to believe. And then the worry is that the moral encroacher doesn't have the resources to identify a difference between what it's epistemically right or permissible for informed Steve and uninformed Steve to believe. Okay, so I want to raise some questions about the interpretation of both the first and the third desideratum that are kind of working in the background of this argument. So I'm going to start with the taking information into account desideratum, the third one. And here, I wonder if the moral encroacher both can and should just resist interpreting this desideratum as requiring there to be some difference in the doxastic state, that it's right or permissible for an informed agent versus an ignorant agent to take up with respect to the racist proposition. And here's why. It seems that it would be morally wrong for Steve in the Steve the waiter to believe that this particular patron is gonna, this particular Black patron is gonna tip less. But intuitively, this belief would be morally wrong because of something about its basing, something about the kind of reasoning that generates the belief. That's where the sort of source of moral wrongness seems to be. What's really doing the work in making this belief morally wrong is something about the nature of the inference or the bit of reasoning that underwrites the belief. And an easy way to see this is just to imagine that Steve forms a belief with the same propositional content, like this patron is likely to tip less than this other patron sitting at this other table, but on a different basis. So like maybe the patron just tells him, I plan to, like, I never tip more than 10% or something. And Steve's like, oh, that's kind of, you know, whatever. It seems like if Steve forms a belief that this patron is likely to tip less than this other patron, but on that basis, that seems morally totally fine. What seems morally problematic is kind of moving from like this patron is Black, and here's the sort of statistical evidence that I have about disparities in tipping practices, moving from that to belief in the proposition. So if what's doing the work in kind of generating what's the source of the moral wrongness has to do with the way the belief is based, then it seems like the moral encroacher should think that's also what's going to be doing the work on the epistemic side. So, so we should expect the moral encroacher to think that the epistemic rightness or wrongness of the belief in the relevant sort of case is similarly explained by facts about basing. And if this is right, then it seems to me that the most natural way of interpreting 3 as requiring that there being, that we need to sort of take into account information about racial disparities and about the race of the individuals with whom we interact with, is as requiring that there be some difference in the epistemically right or permissible way in which informed agents versus ignorant agents base their doxastic states with respect to this sort of racist proposition. I mean, I'll just, as a kind of side note, like designating it a racist proposition is a little misleading here, because the proposition itself sort of only looks racist if a belief in the proposition is based in a certain way. The same proposition, but based on the kind of testimony of the diner, like I never tip above 10%, doesn't seem racist at all. So there's a kind of, I don't know, misdirection, just in kind of calling it a racist proposition. Okay, so if this is the right way to think, then it seems to me that that the moral encroacher should say that in the regular Steve case, like both the information that this person is Black and the information about racial disparities in tipping practices is part of the basis for Steve's potentially both morally and epistemically problematic belief. It's just that when Steve refrains from forming the belief that like this patron is going to tip less, Steve is Steve is reasoning kind of something like this, like the pattern of reasoning, and this is the sort of both morally and epistemically permissible or right pattern of reasoning is something like, well, yeah, sure, I know that in general Black patrons tip less than white patrons, and yeah, I know that this patron is Black, I can see that, but that is not yet enough to lead me to conclude that this patron is going to tip less. I'm suspending. Whereas, and that's the kind of difference between informed Steve versus ignorant Steve, who just doesn't know the race of the patron because he has an eyelash in his eye. Okay. So this to say, I think the moral encroacher maybe has a story to tell that meets desideratum 3. I want to return very quickly to desideratum 1, the no conflict desideratum. And what I want to say here is kind of related to what I've kind of already, the kind of story I've already developed on behalf of the moral encroacher. And that is that the way in which I think the moral encroacher should be committed to desideratum 1, or the version of desideratum 1 that the no conflict desideratum that I think the moral encroacher should embrace and can vindicate is this idea is the idea that moral norms and epistemic norms don't conflict when they have the same kind of, when the target of evaluation is the same. So if the target of evaluation is really sort of attitude, proposition, basing, or basis triads, right? Because all of the action is kind of in the basing. Then we shouldn't get a conflict when we think about what moral norms and what epistemic norms say about which kind of attitude, proposition, basis triads are permissible or right, which ones an agent ought to have. But this leaves open the fact, leaves open the possibility that if we just focus on attitude proposition pairs, like if we ignore the basis, the moral encroacher might say, maybe epistemic norms sort of suggest, certain attitude proposition pairs are permissible and moral norms are just silent with respect to those attitude proposition pairs, or maybe vice versa. Moral norms sort of say certain attitude proposition pairs are morally problematic, but epistemic norms are just silent with respect to those. Like that's not a target of epistemic evaluation, like mere attitude proposition pairs. So I think once we have this sort of more sophisticated way of understanding the no conflict desideratum, it looks like the moral encroachment story can simultaneously get 1 and 3, no problem. And then very quickly, I know I'm really up against time here, but very quickly, I want to say one thing, kind of stepping back, kind of what does this mean? So the second part of this chapter is developing the truth-loving, sophisticated global consequentialist response to these kinds of cases. And I think even if that response gives us a response that we should be pretty happy with, we get a story about our intuitions in these kinds of cases that we should be pretty happy with, then if my critique of Dan's critique of the moral encroachment story goes through, then where we're left is with a kind of stalemate where we just have two different views that can each reasonably adequately account for our intuitions about these kinds of cases. And so we haven't yet got a reason to sort of like sign on to truth-loving consequentialism as opposed to a kind of impure pragmatic encroachment version of sophisticated global consequentialism, for instance, that might enjoy all the virtues that Dan develops for sophisticated global consequentialism in the epistemic domain in the rest of the book. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Dan, I'll leave it to you to respond now. And maybe if there's points of conversation you want to pick up, we can pick those up after, at the end of the session.
Sure.
Just for the sake of time.
Yeah, happy to do that. So Kate, really appreciate the comments here. You're one of the first people outside of like my close group of friends that ever heard about this idea when I started thinking about consequentialism in grad school. So I really appreciate all the support in thinking about these ideas. And in the comments the written comments you gave me, there's a ton of other really great ideas. I want to focus on what you just focused on, which is the stuff about moral encroachment. Although I do want to also call out that in some of the written comments you gave me, there are some interesting arguments for thinking that the view I endorse, the sort of truth-focused view versus a more practical angle on thinking about consequentialism, which is the view you go in for in other writing. I do think that there's interesting discussion to be had there, but I'm going to focus on the moral encroachment stuff. Okay, so I think you're absolutely right, and it's super helpful to point out that a probably better way than what I did in the book to think about these moral encroachment cases is to think about them as cases of, to think about it in terms of basing rather than the content of the proposition at play. And I think you're right that what's intuitively the racist thing in the kind of motivating cases is basing your belief in the proposition on facts about race rather than the proposition itself. And the examples you gave are super, super helpful in illustrating that. The way where I think we land on your way of thinking about it is we have the informed agent who knows the race of the people that they're interacting with. We have the uninformed agent who doesn't know the race of the people that they're interacting with. And the view that you plump for, I don't know if you endorse this view or just say, the moral encroacher should think in these terms. I'm going to assume it's you just for the sake of making the conversation easier. So the view you plump for says, okay, the difference between the informed agent and the uninformed agent is that they're both going to suspend. So that's not a difference. They're both going to suspend about who's going to tip better. But the one who is informed is going to suspend, and part of the basis of their suspending is facts about the race of the people they're interacting with. And the one who's not going to suspend, that person doesn't have facts about race as part of their basis because they don't have those facts at all. And so there is a difference in how they're representing the world, but it's not in the propositions they believe, disbelieve, suspend belief about. It's in facts about the basis for the propositions they believe, disbelieve, or suspend belief about. Okay, so I think that's the view. And if I'm right about that being the view, I I kind of suspect that the argument I gave in the book is still going to apply, although I'd love to hear, if we have time for discussion later, what you think, or 10 years from now, I'm sure I'll still be interested to hear if we haven't had time before that. Okay, so here's how I'm thinking about it. So take the informed agent who knows the race of the person they're talking to, and the uninformed agent who doesn't know the race. And then let's think about how much extra information each one of those agents would need in order to believe the proposition, this couple, so there I'm pointing to the black couple, so this couple is going to tip worse. So let's think about how much extra information they would need. It looks like we can develop a case where, let's add on, so the original case is just the couple's black versus a white couple. Let's make it slightly different, where it's not just that they're black, but they're also wearing cheap looking clothing. So I want to choose some extra proposition so that they're wearing cheap looking clothing, or whatever other proposition you think. And I need it to be a proposition where that proposition, along with the racial facts and all the background facts about the social structure that the waiter knows, is enough for that person to believe. So it's going to be a case where Spencer believes, oh, it's Spencer, not Steve. That's an important detail to get. No. So it's going to need to be a case where Spencer has the information that it's a black couple. Black couples historically have tipped worse. All these other things on the basis of which he suspends in the original case. We're going to add in this new proposition that they're wearing cheap clothes, or whatever you think is enough to tip them over the boundary of, okay, on the basis of all those things, Spencer's going to believe. So informed Spencer's going to believe. Ignorant Spencer will take him, add in that same fact. So ignorant Spencer doesn't know the fact about the race, but he's going to know the fact that they're wearing cheap clothes or whatever it is. And let's assume that that fact, the same one, is not enough to believe that they're not going to tip well. Right. And so my thought is that, okay, so now we have a case where we've got the informed person who's going to believe on the basis of race, plus the basis of clothes, that the person's not going to tip well, whereas the uninformed person is not going to believe on the basis of the clothes that they're not going to tip well. And it seems like if that's what's happening, then I feel like the informed person is still doing something racist, because it was an important part of their basing of their belief that the person was black, that they believed that they're going to tip worse. So I think that's meant to be how I just restructured it. That's meant to be another instance of the kind of argument I give in the book. Whether or not that's actually reflected in the words of the book, of course, is a different thing. And I've had a year to think about it since you last told me these thoughts. So it's a totally fair thing to say that maybe I've sort of secretly changed how I'm thinking about the argument to make this work. But anyways, that's how I'm thinking about it now. Is that it seems like in the cases you described, we're still going to get people doing racist things or thinking racist things in the kinds of basing cases that you described. So maybe I'll stop there for the sake of time, but I would love to hear at some point what you think about that, or if I've misconstrued how to think about the basing cases. But like I said, super helpful comments across the board, and I really like this way of thinking about the cases that Gendler and Basu and other folks in this literature have thought about in terms of basing. I think that helps clarify a lot of things. So really appreciate that. And so thanks again, Kate.
Excellent. Ram, you're up.
Well, thank you, Paul, for inviting me and for arranging this. And thank you, Dan, for writing this great book. I've really enjoyed reading it. I've never been a consequentialist, but until I read this book, I didn't fully understand why. So thank you for that. I still don't fully understand why, but grappling with the book has been a very welcome challenge for me. And thanks also to the commentators, to Kate and Amy. There's so much I want to say about the comments that you both have given, and I'm sorry that I can't spend all my time talking about those instead. But even though the view that Dan develops is a kind of sophisticated consequentialism, I just want to raise a couple of questions that are entirely unsophisticated. And these are all questions about the main thesis of the book. Okay, so the book's main thesis is what Dan calls truth-loving epistemic consequentialism. He had that up on a slide in his intro, but I'll just repeat it now. Truth-loving epistemic consequentialism says, a belief that P is right for an agent to have, if and only if, among all the available options for belief, believing P promotes the greatest overall balance of having true beliefs and not having false beliefs. Okay, so that's the thesis of the whole book. The whole book is intended to argue for that thesis and answer objections to that thesis. And all I want to do today is raise a question about both sides of that biconditional. Right, the biconditional, the if and only if, is not intended by Dan just to be a biconditional. It's intended to be an explanatory claim. Right, on the left-hand side, it says a belief that P is right for an agent to have. That's the thing that Dan wants to explain. And then on the right-hand side, among all the available options for belief, believing P promotes the greatest overall balance, that's the thing that's supposed to explain rightness, right? So there's the thing that's supposed to be explained, the thing that's supposed to explain it, and I want to raise one basic question about each of those two things. All right, so let me first start by raising my question about the explanandum, right belief. So Dan says that for a belief to be right, in his sense, is for a belief to be one that the agent should have, but not necessarily one that it's rational for the agent to have. Okay, now that can arouse a certain suspicion, because a lot of consequentialists and anti-consequentialists have been theorizing about the conditions of rational belief or justified belief. And now here's Dan introducing a status of right belief that he says is definitely different from the status of rational belief. And so you might worry, well, wait a second, is he just inventing this status so that he can design something there, we can find something or other for consequentialism to be right about, even if the thing that it's right about is just a creature of the theory, right? So that's a certain worry, but let's explore that. So let's try to figure out what rightness is, what it corresponds to in our ordinary practice of epistemic appraisal. Now, the main thing that Dan says about rightness, arguing that it's distinct from rationality, but also distinct from truth, the main things he says about that are in the first chapter of his book, and in particular, I want to look at the arguments in section 1.3 of his book, and I'll tell you about the examples he provides there. So he gives an example of 6-year-old Clara, whom he tells us, and now this is a quote from Dan's description of the example, Clara believes, I can't ever say this without smiling. 6-year-old Clara believes that it's a conceptual truth that parallel lines never intersect, something that's false, but only because of the possibility of non-Euclidean spaces. Right?
Ram, I don't have any kids. Can you tell?
Yeah. So, so now if Clara were questioned about whether parallel lines could intersect, she would be confused about the question and argue that her belief that they can't intersect necessarily follows from the concepts, from the definitions of parallel or of line, right? She can't even understand what the non-Euclidean truth is like, right? In giving this example, Dan is assuming that actual space is non-Euclidean, And I gather that assumption is a safe one, right? Physicists say that actual space is non-Euclidean, or at least since Einstein, they say this. So there's this fact about actual space that it's non-Euclidean. This fact that parallel lines can intersect because the space is non-Euclidean, and that's a fact that Clara, 6-year-old Clara, cannot so much as understand, according to this example. And it's contrary to what she believes. Now, since it's a fact that she can't so much as understand, she also can't believe it, and because she can't believe it, it can't be the case that she ought to believe it. So it can't be something that is right for her to believe. Because rightness, whatever else is true of rightness, it's a deontic status. It's a kind of ought or a kind of should, and so it implies can. What's right for someone to believe has to be something that they can believe. And so since the intersection of parallel lines is not something that 6-year-old Clara can believe, it can't be right for her to believe it. Right? Okay, so this is an argument intended to show that what it's right for someone to believe is not always a true belief. Okay, now let's consider this argument for a moment. So Clara possesses the concept of parallelism and of intersection and of lines, right? She has all these concepts that she uses when she forms the belief that parallel lines can't intersect. But if she has these concepts, then she can presumably at least entertain various propositions that are composable from these concepts, including the proposition, which she denies, of course, but she can at least entertain the proposition that parallel lines intersect, right? She can entertain it enough that she understands what she's denying when she denies it. If she didn't understand what she's denying, then she couldn't deny it. Okay, but just because she's able to entertain the proposition still doesn't mean she's able to believe it any more than my possession of the concepts of square and of circularity enables me to believe that a particular square is circular, excuse me. But wait a second, though. I think that's too fast. I just said I'm unable to believe that a particular square is circular, but is that really true that I'm unable to believe that? I mean, here's some circumstances I could imagine. I hope you can imagine these circumstances as well. Right there, they're prominent mathematicians, maybe who specialize in topology. And they're all lining up to explain to me how a particular square could be circular. Now, of course, as I describe this scenario, it sounds wildly implausible, right? But it also sounded implausible to me until I learned about non-Euclidean spaces to think that parallel lines could ever intersect, right? That also sounded implausible to me, just as it must sound ridiculous to precocious 6-year-old Clara. So the scenario I'm describing does sound pretty implausible to me, but I can imagine it. I can conceive of it. And when I conceive of that scenario, I imagine that the prominent mathematicians are offering all kinds of subtle and very complicated considerations that I can't quite follow. But the gravamen of all their considerations is that a particular square can be circular. I don't get it, but here are these prominent mathematicians saying it, so I guess I should believe them. I guess I should take their word for it, even though I don't understand how it could be true. Right now, that's something I can conceive of. Right? And when I imagine those circumstances, when I conceive of those circumstances, right, it looks like, at least in some sense, I can come to believe that a particular square is circular. I mean, I don't quite grasp what it is that I'm believing, but at least I believe that there must be something that they're telling me that's likely to be true, even if I don't fully understand what it is that they're telling me. I can come to suspect that what I have in mind when I think about a square being circular must be, something confused and very limited. But mathematical reality, I imagine, is this much more subtle, complicated thing that the mathematicians are trying to explain to me with whatever lack of success. Okay, so in this case, it looks like, in some sense, I do have the ability to believe that a square is circular, and I have that ability just by virtue of having the relevant concepts. But if I do have the ability to believe that a square is circular just by virtue of having the relevant concepts, then I would assume that Clara also has the ability to believe that parallel lines intersect just by virtue of having the relevant concepts. Right? Now again, there's ability and there's ability. Ability can be said in many ways. So at first we said, look, Clara has the concepts, but she can't quite get herself to believe that parallel lines intersect. That just seems so implausible. But then we tried to imagine circumstances in which, maybe her parents or her math teacher or, right, any number of respected figures tried to get her to see that parallel lines could intersect. And even if she couldn't come to see it, right, even if she didn't quite get it, she still understands enough about their authority to invest some trust in them. And so she could, in some sense, be able to believe that parallel lines intersect, even if she doesn't understand the basis of that. She doesn't understand what could make that the case, but she understands the authority of the people who are trying to explain to her that it's the case. But similarly, I could, in some sense, I could come to believe that a particular square is circular just by virtue of understanding the authority of the people who are trying to explain it to me, even if I couldn't quite grasp what it is that I'm believing there. Okay. So what should we say about Clara then? Well, it looks like if she has the concepts necessary to form the idea of parallel lines not intersecting, right? If she has the concepts necessary to form the belief that she does form, then it looks like she's also able, at least in some sense, to form the contrary belief. So I'm not sure why it is that just because rightness is a deontic status, and so rightness, being a deontic status, requires the agent's ability to form a belief that's right, why it is that that means right belief can't be true belief, right? If you can form any belief on an issue because you have the concepts necessary to form the belief on that issue, then why can't you form a true belief on that issue? Why isn't your ability to form a belief on that issue itself sufficient for your ability to form a true belief on that issue? Okay, so that is intended to put some pressure on the idea that right belief has to be distinct from true belief. Now let's consider whether right belief has to be distinct from rational belief, right? Because again, Dan wants right belief to be somewhere, to be something other than these two statuses, right? It's not supposed to be true belief, but it's also not supposed to be rational belief. It's supposed to be some third thing. Okay. Well, let's go back to Clara again. What we could say is, look, Clara maybe doesn't currently have the ability to believe that parallel lines intersect, but she would gain that ability if her circumstances changed in the way that I described, right? So maybe maybe when I describe the circumstances changing in this particular way, having a bunch of experts in whom Clara invested some authority, having those experts all telling her that parallel lines can intersect, right? Or trying to explain to her about non-Euclidean spaces. Even if Clara doesn't get it, she still sees that these people are testifying, these people are authoritative. Maybe that changes Clara's abilities in a way that enables her now to believe that parallel lines intersect, where she wasn't able to believe that before the experts were around. But maybe that's what we should say. Well, of course, there are clear cases where someone gains an ability only when they exercise it for the first time, right? Like a newborn baby gains the ability to breathe only when they breathe for the first time. These cases seem quite different from the case of Clara, gaining an ability to believe something just when she hears these experts testifying to it. When the experts authoritatively announce something seemingly preposterous to Clara, right, their announcements don't seem to give us new abilities to believe things that we haven't already believed. Rather, it seems like those announcements just provoke us to exercise abilities that we already had, right? If we didn't already have those abilities, it's not clear how the announcements alone could impart those abilities to us. But maybe Singer doesn't need to describe a case where Clara is simply unable to believe the truth, right? Like the case where she's unable to believe that parallel lines intersect, like they do in actual non-Euclidean space. Maybe it suffices for his purposes if he makes a more nuanced point about her abilities in relation to the truth. Namely, she can exercise her ability to believe the truth only if she acquires some surprising new information, let's say from expert testimony, right? And if we grant that claim, then we can also grant that a necessary condition of its being right for someone to believe something is that they're able to believe it even without acquiring any new and surprising information. But once we impose that condition, then cases like the case of Clara are going to clearly suffice to distinguish right belief from true belief. Clara's ability to believe the truth depends on her acquiring new and surprising information. But if her ability to believe what's right does not depend on acquiring such information, then what's right for her to believe clearly differs from what's true. But the problem is if Dan adopts that strategy for distinguishing right belief from true belief, then he gets into a different problem. Because remember, he also wants to distinguish right belief from rational belief. And according to him, rational belief is what you subjectively ought to believe, whereas right belief is what you objectively ought to believe. Okay, here's the way he draws that distinction. I'm going to quote from his book here. Suppose there's an agent Brian. There's an agent Brian who sometimes appears in my notes as Brain. So Brian, suppose there's an agent Brian and the cup in front of him appears green and he believes the cup is green. And let's also suppose that unbeknownst to Brian, he only believes the cup is green because of a complicated set of mirrors that would make the cup appear green even if it weren't. Okay, now consider theories of what Brian ought to believe. Subjective theories of what Brian ought to believe can only take into account the information available to Brian. So the only information the theories can excuse me. So the only information the theories can... Sorry, Dan, I'm getting your quote wrong. My apologies. So the only information the theories can apply in light of is information about how the cup appears to Brian and his belief that the cup is green. No, that is your quote. No, I did get your quote right. I just couldn't parse it. So objective theories of belief rightness can apply in light of facts about how the cup appears to Brian. Right. Objective theories of belief rightness can apply in light of strictly more information, right? How the cup appears to Brian, the fact that Brian believes the cup is green, the fact that the cup is in fact green, and the fact that Brian is in this odd mirror involving situation, right? So those additional facts, right? Objective theories of belief rightness can apply in light of those additional facts. Now, according to your distinction, Dan, what it's right for Brian to believe is what Brian objectively ought to believe, and what Brian objectively ought to believe doesn't just depend on the facts that are available to Brian, right? It also depends on the mirror involving facts. But notice that the only situations in which the facts that are not available to Brian would substantively affect what Brian ought to believe are those situations in which those same facts constitute new and surprising information to Brian if they were revealed to him, right? Like the green appearance of the cup in front of him results from this bizarre arrangement of mirrors, right? In cases in which the facts that are not available to Brian would not come as surprising news, let's say because they're already known to him, or else they're likely to be true anyway, given his evidence, or else they make no difference to what he ought to believe. In those cases, there's not going to be any difference between what Brian objectively ought to believe and what he subjectively ought to believe, right? So there's no difference between what's right and what's rational for him to believe, given the way you distinguish rightness from rationality. Right, so the distinction between the objective and the subjective ought depends on the obtaining of facts that would constitute new and surprising information to Brian. Only if there are facts like that, and they're relevant to what Brian ought to believe, only then can Brian's belief be right without being rational, or vice versa. So to distinguish right belief from rational belief, you need for there to be some difference made by facts that aren't yet available to Brian, which means that they would be new and surprising information to him if they were introduced to him. Now, recall from our earlier discussion of the difference between right belief and true belief, that what it's right for someone to believe depends on what someone can believe without acquiring new and surprising information. So now let's ask whether, without acquiring any new or surprising information, Brian can, looking at this cup, believe that the cup might not be green. Well, of course, it's easy to imagine versions of the situation in which Brian can easily believe that the cup might not be green, right? He might, have independent grounds for suspicion about the way things appear. But notice that in such versions of the situation, Brian does have information that leads him to suspect that the situation might not be the way it appears. But we can also imagine versions of the situation in which Brian has no such information, and so no reason to suspect that the situation is not as it appears, right? In at least many such versions of the case, Brian can no more readily believe that the cup might not be green than, let's say, you could believe that you might be a rabbit, or that your head might be made of glass, or that a square might be a circle, or that parallel lines could intersect, right? All of these things sound equally ridiculous, even if we don't start categorizing some of them as conceptual truth and others as, obvious truth. Right? We just think of all of them as obvious, undeniable truth, right? Without worrying about whether or not they're conceptual. Okay, so here's a way of summing up the worry that I have right now about right belief. if we try to distinguish right belief from true belief, just by appeal to right beliefs requiring an agent's being able to believe, right? Whereas true belief doesn't require an agent being able to believe. Well, then it's not clear that we can draw a useful distinction, since any agent who can so much as entertain a proposition has some ability to believe it. But if we try to distinguish right belief from true belief by appeal to right belief requiring the agent to believe it without acquiring new and surprising information, like testimony from apparent experts, right? Then we seem to have imposed a requirement on right belief that it can satisfy only on pain of collapsing into rational belief, right? So what Dan needs to do is find a way of distinguishing right belief both from true belief and from rational belief. And my worry is that the procedures that he uses to try to distinguish right belief from true belief are procedures that are going to lead it to collapse into rational belief. So I'm trying to find some normative status that's not true belief and that's not rational belief, and that is involved in our ordinary epistemic practices, right? Isn't just a creature of Dan's theory, that truth-loving epistemic consequentialism can be a good theory about. Okay, and that's the main thing I wanted to say. I have one last question for Dan. This will take a lot less time. And this is about his explanation of right belief. He says it's what promotes the greatest overall balance of having true beliefs and not having false beliefs. But of course, as Dan very well knows, there are lots of different ways of specifying and measuring this quantity that is said to be promoted, right? And Dan doesn't spend much of the book talking about what precisely that quantity is. And the reason I worry a bit about that is because I'd like to see that for the theory to make testable predictions, we need to know a bit about about precisely what quantity this is, whose beliefs count, do all the beliefs count equally? Does everybody's belief count equally? How do we weigh some beliefs against others? Does every belief count for one, or do they count differently? Is it a democracy of beliefs or is it like an epistocracy where some beliefs matter more than others? And so any illumination from Dan concerning these issues, I'd be very grateful for. So thank you, Dan.
Thanks so much, Ram. So really, really appreciate the comments there. And so I mentioned last time that Kate and I have talked about these issues for a really long time. Amy and I have also talked about these issues for a really long time. And Ram, you and I have only talked about these issues for like 5 or 6 years or something. But a lot of the things that you've said have really dramatically influenced really big picture things about how I frame the project. And I really appreciate all of your help and guidance there. So here you push me on 2 really big important issues for the project. So one is about what is right belief, the main thing that the book is about. And then the other thing is how do we measure the epistemic goodness that I claim we can understand right belief in terms of. Let me just try to briefly give some responses there, but I suspect we could go back and forth about this for at least another 5 or 6 years, and I hope we're able to do that. So on right belief, let me first say something that's a little bit biographical, but I'm going to call it methodological for the sake of sounding like an academic for a second. So I think in epistemology, there's a lot of normative terms. So there's rational, justified, warranted, and as just sort of like, those are ones that evaluate belief without calling them knowledge. And then we have terms like epistemic reasons and evidence and, probability, okay, so we have all of these ways of thinking about beliefs. And so the methodological approach that I'm trying to give in the book is, let's push that all aside for a second and think about epistemology as a field that's trying to answer the question, what should we believe? And then I want to just say right at the beginning, okay, let's try to answer that question. What should we believe? Let's call that thing right belief. The thing that we should believe in any situation is the right belief in that situation. And that's how I want to use the word right belief. And then on a methodological level, and I argue that this as a substantive issue turns out not to be true, but on a methodological level, I'm okay with thinking then if it turns out that right belief and rational belief are the same thing, cool. That'll be an interesting insight. If it turns out that right belief, again, in this sense, I want to use it as a thing we should believe, turns out to be the same thing as true belief, then cool, that'll be another insight. So as I said, I end up thinking that both of those things are false, but as a methodological point, that's where right belief kind of comes from. It's the thing that we should believe. Okay, so you've pushed on my arguments for thinking that right belief isn't true belief, which you're right. The kind of most direct argument I give for that is the Clara case. I think you and I might have some differing intuitions about what's going on in the Clara case, and I think it boils down to this. And again, I suspect this is something we could talk about for a while. So in Clara's case, I'm imagining it's conceptually impossible for her to believe that parallel lines intersect. And what I mean by that is that it's not just implausible. Like if an expert told me, I work next to this major hospital, and if a doctor there comes and tells me, oh, it turns out that smoking is healthy, I would find that highly implausible. But it's not impossible for me to believe that. It's just something I think is very unlikely to be true. In Clara's case, when she tries to think about parallel lines intersecting, her mind is just like, what? That's like, what? There's not she can't imagine that. There's no thing in her brain that's that. So okay, but we can make sense of something like, okay, if an expert tells her that that's true, what could she be thinking about? Well, if in her head she's kind of stuck and she thinks there's nothing, 2 + 2 is 5. What do you mean? Parallel lines intersect? No, they just can't. So what would be going on in a case where an expert tells her that this is true? So I do think something she could entertain is that the words parallel lines intersect pick out a true proposition. I think she could entertain that meta-linguistic proposition of, oh, maybe I'm using the words wrong, or the way I'm thinking about lines is different from how you're thinking about lines. So I think she could entertain that meta-linguistic thing, but the way that she's thinking about lines and parallelness, it just makes it literally impossible from her perspective that they intersect. It's not that like, oh, it's unlikely. It's just that doesn't mean anything. There's no thing that picks out. So, okay, so I think whether or not we agree on whether or not that's the right way to think about impossibility in this sense, I think whether or not we agree on that is gonna really be the issue, the crux of the issue about whether or not we agree about what's going on in the Clara case. Okay, so I think so to explore that, I would want to go down that line further. I do want to say, though, that I think the book project as a whole kind of offers another reason to think that right belief isn't true belief. Because if you get on board with the project as a whole, so the project tries to argue that the way you should think about right belief is in terms of conducing to goodness. Well, if you get on board with that, then you're going to think, okay, well, sometimes believing false things conduces to epistemic goodness. So you'll get on board with that. The kind of second most direct route I go in for that in the book is in chapter 2. I try to argue that there's these cases of permissible trade-offs where we do think it's intuitively the epistemically right thing to do for people to believe false things in order to get true beliefs later. And so I think you could view each one of those cases as also a less direct argument for thinking that right belief is true belief. Comes apart from true belief. Because the thought is, the way I'm using the word right belief just means the thing that we should believe. And then these permissible trade-off cases are supposed to be ones in which the thing we should believe is a false thing. And so, yeah, okay. So, I'll move on to the sort of last thing I want to say for the sake of time here. So the second big question you bring up is about how to understand the overall balance of true beliefs to false belief. And I think that's absolutely a huge question that this view has to answer. And I don't have a satisfying answer to it. And I think you're absolutely right that like to fully flesh out this view, you need an answer to that. And that's going to be a big project. So why do I think it's okay then to like, what do I think this book contributes if it doesn't answer that question? Well, as I was saying at the beginning, I think a lot of thinkers have thought that true belief is kind of epistemically central, and then attempts to explain other epistemic stuff in terms of that true belief haven't gotten very far. So a lot of the value of the book is saying that the reasons that people have thought that we can't make sense of what we ought to believe in terms of epistemic goodness. A lot of the value of the book is overcoming those objections. So I think you're right that I don't give the full story, but I do undermine objections for thinking that there couldn't be a full story. And I think we should feel at least moderately confident that a full story is possible. Some reasons to think that. So in the formal literature on these same questions, there's an extensive literature on what formal folks call scoring rules, which is kind of a technical way of trying to measure this quantity. And you're absolutely right to point out, Ram, that literature is hugely controversial. There's lots of people who disagree about what the scoring rules should look like and stuff. But I do think that the fact that people are taking this seriously as like a question to be answered is some evidence that we're all grasping onto the same sort of idea here, that there is something we're trying to collectively measure. I also think, putting aside that kind of formal thing, it's just very intuitive to think that there's a sense in which flat earthers are worse off epistemically than round earthers. Round earthers? Whatever, not flat earthers. And so what all we need to think, I think, is that we're going to be able to find a way of capturing that, right? And I agree, it's going to be complicated, so I don't think it's going to be easy, but I do think we should think that project's going to work out. So there's a lot of open questions there. One of the big open questions that you bring out is this question of whose beliefs are going to matter. Is it just the agent who has the belief that we're counting as right and wrong? Is it just their beliefs? Or is it all beliefs, like of all agents? Or is it, even all beliefs of all agents in the past and the future, and all possible agents? How should we think about that? So I have a particular view here, and I want to be really clear that I don't think anything in the book hangs on this, but I suspect that the right answer is that all beliefs matter. So not just the agent's beliefs, but other people's beliefs, and possibly even future, not currently existing people's beliefs. I think that's a kind of spicy answer to this question. Like I said, I don't think anything that I say in the book depends on that. And then one sort of modifier, and then I'll stop talking, Paul, is that I think so let's call views that say that all beliefs matter, let's call those collective theories of epistemic value, because they include everyone. And then individual theories are going to be, so I suspect that collective theories of epistemic value aren't going to differ collective theories of epistemic value, when you plug them into a consequentialist framework, the overall predictions aren't going to differ very much from the individual theories. And the reason why I think this is true is for the same reason that I think truth begets truth is true. So that's one of the, we talked about that at length earlier. And the idea is it's going to be pretty unusual for there to be cases where an individual having false beliefs is what gets the collective to have true beliefs. Certainly cases like that can happen. And I think there's sort of weird truth fairy ones, and Amy's comments have made me suspect that there may be sort of more important structural cases where that happens true as well. But I suspect it's generally true that an individual having a more accurate picture of the world is what conduces to all of us having a more accurate picture of the world, in general, not always, but in general. And so if that's true, then we should think that collective theories of epistemic value will make directionally the same kind of predictions as individual theories of epistemic value. And so then when you plug them into consequentialist theories, I suspect they won't often disagree. So that's a very tiny part of defending that kind of picture, but I think that's a defense of that is going to go way beyond the negative few minutes that we have to continue this discussion here. So maybe I'll stop there. I hope we get to discuss these things further. Like I said, I think I'm super appreciative of all the comments from you, Ram, but also from Amy and Kate earlier. Such an honor to have you guys think about this, and I hope we can continue these discussions going forward. So thanks a lot.